This program was paid for by the friends and partners of Jeff Strucker Ministries. Welcome to Jeff Strucker Ministries. Jeff spent most of his adult life serving his country as an Army Ranger in countless combat missions. For his leadership and sacrifice, Jeff was inducted into the Army Ranger Hall of Fame. And then, God called Jeff to a new mission. Now, Jeff is passionately dedicated to guiding men and their families into a real, rugged, and relentless faith in King Jesus. And now, here's warrior and pastor, Jeff Strucker.
Preach in 3, 2, 1.
I don't know about you, but this week has been a week for me. Yesterday was insane. I just left North Carolina, and I was in the classroom with a bunch of church leaders. And I want you to imagine that you were sitting in this classroom, and there's a student that's on your right-hand side that's nodding and saying, yep, I get it. I'm totally in agreement with everything that I'm hearing today. But that student absolutely refuses to turn in any work. And then there's another lady on the opposite side of you, and she's sitting there with her arms across her chest, and she's saying, I don't know if I like what I'm hearing. I'm not sure I agree with what I'm hearing, but she does the work, and she puts her heart into the lessons and the assignments, and she turns her stuff in. Which of the two is going to pass, and which of the two is going to fail? This guy says, I agree with it, but he doesn't do it. She says, I'm not sure I agree with it, but she does it. Which of the two is going to fail the course? Look, faith and following Jesus is not really a pass-fail exam, but there are some words that you and I can say, then the work just doesn't line up with it. And today, Jesus is going to just tackle the idea of saying that you worship me with your words, but you don't really show that you worship with me with your work. Basically, what Jesus is going to challenge us with today is the idea of a duty to practice our faith. I'm going to look at one verse first, and we're going to look at this verse separately before we get into this analogy that Jesus uses, because this verse leaves no room for confusion. Luke chapter 6, verse 46, here's what Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I say?" Now, I'm going to unpack this phrase, Lord, Lord, for just a second, because if you were reading the book of Matthew, this part of the Bible is the Sermon on the Mount. On the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is radically redefining what it means to follow Him, what it means to worship God. And He's basically saying, hey, if you think you can do it by just accomplishing the letter of the law, you're missing it. And it's actually the heart and the habits that God expects of people. The word Lord, when it shows up in your Bible, depending on the translation of the Bible, it will sometimes have lowercase letters, which means it's referring to like a boss or a master. Sometimes it will have capital L, and then depending on your translation of the Bible, it may have all capital letters L-O-R-D. And when you see the word Lord show up in the Bible that way, it's a reference to God. But when you see Lord, Lord, He's saying your boss and your God. Why do you say that I'm your God and you say that you're my servant if, and then fill in the rest of the blank here, and really what you see is Jesus describing worship for us today. You say that you worship me, but do you really worship me? I know what your words are saying, but do you really worship me? Now, the word worship doesn't come up in this passage today, but you just need to know that in the Bible, there's a range of meanings for this word. It typically means either your heart or your habits, or in some cases, it means both. Like in the book of Genesis, the word worship means you're declaring that God is creator and God is master, and that means God calls the shots and I don't. When you get to the book of Psalms, the word worship means that God has captured my heart and I adore Him. He has given me His heart and I have given Him His and my heart, and He adores me because I adore Him. When you get to the New Testament, you've already heard it from Pastor Troy today, The Bible makes it very clear. God expects our worship to be in spirit and in truth. John chapter 4, which means it's much more about the heart than getting up and going to a building. You don't have to go to a temple in Jerusalem anymore. And by the time you get to this passage, your worship and your words have to line up together. Your work and your worship is your words. And if you have one without the other, we got a problem. That's basically what Jesus is saying today. Jesus created his church. He called his church so that you and I would be the people who live out our faith in front of the world. And everything that we do is worship. It comes from our words, but it also comes from our work. So you got to ask, why does Jesus use this language? Hey, why do you call me Lord, Lord? And I think really what he's saying right here, if you were standing in the crowd, I think what you would hear is, who are you fooling? Do you think you're fooling me by using that kind of language when you and I both know I can see inside your heart? And I know what's going on inside your heart. So your words can say one thing, but you and I both know that's not where your heart is. And maybe he's asking, or are you trying to fool you? Is getting up and doing these religious deeds and saying the right answers to the right questions, are you trying to fool yourself? Because let's be honest, you ain't fooling me. And you're probably not even fooling you, so why do you even bother? I'll never forget, I was a sergeant in the Ranger Regiment living in the barracks. It was embarrassing to be a staff sergeant living in the barracks and my boss inspecting my room with a white glove in the morning before I went to formation. But one night, there was nothing going on, and I was in the hallway talking to another Ranger sergeant who was also living in the barracks, and we just started a conversation, and that conversation eventually turned to Jesus. And during the course of this conversation in the barracks hallway, I shared with him who Jesus was and what Jesus has done for me and how Jesus can totally and radically change this guy's life. And folks, I'm telling you, he was locked in and he was listening to every word. I can see in his eyes that every single word that I was saying was registering with him. And so at the end of the conversation, I just said, hey man, what about you? Do you want Jesus to change your life the same way that he changed my life? And he paused for a second. And he looked at me, and I will never, ever forget his words. I have thought about this response 1,000 times. He looked at me, and he said, no. And I was shocked. I was dumbfounded when he said no. And I was like, I don't understand. Did you hear what I was saying to you? Do you understand the offer that Jesus is making to you? If you will turn your life over to him, he will radically, totally change you. And this is what I will never forget for the rest of my life. He said, Jeff, I heard every word you said, and I believe it. But I like my sin too much to turn my life over to Jesus. And what I'm hearing you say is if Jesus takes over my heart, he's going to change my life. And I like my sin too much for that to happen, so no, I don't want it, and I'm not interested because I enjoy my sin right now. And I sat there with my mouth open, not knowing what to say next. I have thought about this guy's response 1,000 times because I sometimes wonder if this guy is more honest with his worship than some people who show up in church on Sunday morning, because at least he's real with himself and he's real with Jesus about where his heart is right now. And what Jesus says is, why do you even waste your time and my time using the phrase, Lord, Lord, if your heart is far from me? I'll make you a promise this week. I'll give you a money-back guarantee. If you this week, before you open the Bible, before you bow your head to pray, before you step into a church, before you go to a small group, before you do anything spiritual this week, right before you do it, if you will just simply say, God, if there is something in my life that's not supposed to be there, will you show me right now? God, if there is something in my life that I know should be there, but it's not, will you show me right now? And if you show me, I promise you, God, I will do it. All I'm asking you to do is just show me. If you will start with that 5-second prayer before you open the Bible, before you start to pray, before you go to a small group, before you go to church, before you serve, before you do anything. If you will start with that attitude, I promise you, your life next Sunday will look different. You keep doing that, and your life will look radically different. Because Jesus wants radical transformation, not just information or even inspiration. And the proof here is that he gives this little test, this stress test, to determine how strong the foundation of your faith is. I don't think Jesus is trying to trick people. I don't think he's setting us up to fail. But before we read what he says next, he's basically saying there is a way to measure if somebody really, really believes it. And it's not their words. Their words alone can't show you that. There's a stress test. You have something going on with your heart. Look, we're going to do some lab work and we're going to try to measure some of the fluids. And we'll even put you on a machine and we'll do an EKG and we'll test the heart. But if we really, really want to know what's going on in the heart, we got to put the heart through some stress. And how the heart responds to the stress, that will tell us how strong the heart is. Did you hear what I'm saying? Listen, sometimes the only way you will ever know how strong the foundation is when the storms of life happen. Sometimes it's only when the crisis comes that you get a chance to see, the people around you get a chance to see how strong the heart really is. You can't get there on the good days only. There's sometimes, unfortunately, that it's going to take a storm of life or the stress of life to really see how strong the foundation is. And that's exactly what Jesus says next in verse 47. I'll show you what someone is like. I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, three things, hears my words and doesn't stop there, acts on them. And then here's the stress test. He's like a man who's building a house, who dug down deep and he laid the foundation on the rock. When the floods came, and God forbid the floods are going to come sometimes in your life. I wish they didn't, but you and I need those floods from time to time to show us how strong the foundation is. When the floods came, the rivers crashed against that house. And here it is, y'all. And that house, that river, couldn't shake the house. And the reason why is because the house is well built. If you read this exact same passage in the book of Matthew, Jesus just gives you the answer to the test question in Matthew. The reason why is because he is the foundation stone, and you built the house on him, and he's stronger than the rivers. He's stronger than the storms of life. And it's the storms of life that show you if there really is strength in the heart or how strong your faith really is. I don't like the stress. I don't like the crises any more than you do. But those crises can show you something that the good times can't show you. I think Jesus knew exactly what he was doing when he used this analogy. You see, the book of Luke was written by a guy who's trying to convince a Roman official that Jesus really is the Son of God. So Luke is writing this book to a Roman officer, but he's telling this Roman officer about how Jesus really was the King of the Jews. And Jesus uses an analogy that Luke recognizes this fits perfectly for the Romans as well as the Jews. You see, the Romans would build houses with a basement, but the Jews didn't have to. In Jesus' day, Jews would just build a house right into the side of the hill, where there's already rock. And the house would be built on the rock on the side of the hill. As long as the hill stands, the house stands. But in Rome, we don't have that kind of land. So in Rome, we have to dig down deep and we have to build a house down deep. And the Romans typically built a basement for their house. Jews don't have basements, Romans do. So when Luke is using the dig down deep language, the Roman official is saying, of course, that's why we build a basement. Because if you don't have a basement down on the bedrock, this house is going to fall apart. But the Jews heard something very specific as well. The Jews heard, we live in the desert where it's porous and lots of shifting soil. And we don't get a lot of rain in the desert, so there's not a lot of rivers. But everybody knows who lives in the desert, you never, ever build a house in a wadi. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you're trying to build. It may have been 100 years since there was water in that wadi, but nobody is crazy enough to build a house in a desert wadi or a desert valley, because everybody who lives in that land knows one of these days there's going to be a storm, and that storm is going to start to gather in that little valley, that little wadi, and that storm will sweep through that wadi like a runaway bulldozer, and everything in its path will be absolutely washed off of the face of the earth. It might have been 100 years since there was water in that wadi, but nobody is crazy enough to build there. Because if you build, it might not be there one day. And Jesus is using wadi language, basement language here, and saying, would you go to the banks of the Chattahoochee River and try to build a house right on the banks of the river with no foundation? Because let me tell you what the insurance company is going to tell you. Are you crazy? We're not going to give you any money when that house gets swept away. And the builder's going to look at you and say, I'm not even going to bother, because there's going to be a moment in the future where there won't even be one brick standing on top of another. So why would I even waste my energy? You can waste your money if you want, but I'm not going to waste my energy on this river. Jesus is setting a trap. Look, it's not a trick. I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to set up, it's impossible for you to be strong enough in your own power to handle all of the crises of life. In fact, he's almost quoting one of the most terrifying, in my opinion, the most terrifying verses in the entire Bible. Luke chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus springs the trap and he says, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father. He goes on to say, some of you are going to come up to me on the last days and you're going to say, man, we did all of these miracles and we drove out demons and we did great things in your name. And Jesus says, I'm going to look at you and say, depart from me. I never knew you, or you never knew me. You had all of the right words. You might even try to do some of the right things in your own power, but it's impossible to do on your own. I am going to have to be the one, the foundation that you build on. In fact, here's the trick. You can't accomplish this on your own, but I can do it through you. And if you'll let me, I will do it through you. Those of you who were with us last week, Peter said it this way: when Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of your life, he makes you want to follow him. He doesn't just make you obedient. He makes you want to do your duty, because he's actually making it easy to do it, because it's him doing it. It's just him doing it through you. And really what Jesus is offering here is, if you try to do it on your own, if you try to be the foundation of your own world, at some point the storm is going to be so strong that everything around you is going to come crumbling down. So don't be foolish. Don't build it on your own strength or on your own power. Let me do that, and let me do that through you. If you're going to build a massive structure, the most important, perhaps the hardest, and maybe the longest part of the construction project is going to be the foundation. Does anybody know the tallest building in the world right now? Does anybody know where that building is? It's called the Burj Khalifa Tower. It's located in Dubai. It just opened a few years ago, and they just smashed every record with this tower. It's not even close to the second tallest building in the world. In fact, here it is, the top 10 tallest buildings in the world. Only one of them is found in the United States. And this massive structure dominates all of them. When they were starting to work on this tower, by the way, the engineering firm, the design firm that designed this building is an American company from Chicago, the same company that built the Sears Tower in Chicago when it was the tallest building on earth. And they said, hey, here's the building that we want to build, but we need somebody to check the soil. So they went and drilled 130 holes in the middle of Dubai to see what the soil conditions were like. And they drilled down between the the sand and the silt, and they found some rock, and they're like, awesome, we're good, right? But they kept drilling just a little bit deeper, and they realized that that rock is shallow, and it's not attached to anything. And when they drilled through the rock, there was nothing but junk below it. And then they started saying, well, how on earth are we going to try to build a massive skyscraper when there is literally no bedrock underneath it? So they came up with this unusual, unheard of plan. They poured 45,000 cubic meters of concrete. If you want to know how big that is, think of 111 football fields of concrete. But inside that concrete, they built 150 pylons deep into the soil, through the sand, through the rock, and down into the silt below it. All of that soil, all of that concrete, and all of the pylons anchored the ground together. It basically became like a giant hairbrush. And then they started stacking buildings up and stacking buildings around it so that they would hold up the center structure. And essentially what engineers did for the first time in human history is created a building that will move. And when the ground below it starts to move, it grabs the ground below it, and the entire building moves with the ground below it. No matter where the ground goes, the building goes. As long as the hairbrush stays intact, the building can stand up. But if the pylons start to or no longer can support one another, that building will come crashing to the ground. By the way, if you want to get on the elevator, it goes from 0 to 156 stories in the air. That's half a mile in the air before you even get to the antenna. It is by far the tallest structure on earth. And what Jesus is saying is, who would be crazy enough to try to build something like this that doesn't have something below it that can hold it up? Who would be crazy enough? I think this is really what he's asking. To try to build a life that doesn't have something bigger than you below it that can hold it up. And when you start to build your life, let's just get real with each other. You can come to me. You can hear my words. You can even be able to repeat my words back to me. But let's go back to the classroom for just a second. You're like that guy sitting right next to me in the classroom who says, I get every word that you're saying. I agree with every word that you're saying, but doesn't turn the work in. Does this guy pass the class? And the one on the other side of you, the lady who's saying, I'm not even sure I like what I'm hearing right now, but she does the work and she turns it in. This is the lady who aces the class. And what Jesus is saying is, listen, it's your words and your work that really show us your worship. Your words alone are good, but not good enough. And your work alone, if it's your own work on your own power, it can't be good enough. But if your words believe in me, and if you will let me, I will start to work through you. And I will start to do in you first what you can't do in yourself. I will do through you what you couldn't possibly accomplish on your own. And duty without devotion, a heart without the hands, it's just dreary. But devotion without duty is a dereliction of responsibilities. And Jesus is saying, if you're my people, then you need to do both. And the second rock that we're asking you to put in your life today is before you open the Bible, before you pray, before you go to church, before you get in a small group, before you do anything spiritual this week, would you dare ask God, God, is there something in my life that shouldn't be there? Because I know I'm supposed to live for you. I know I'm supposed to look like you. Would you take something out of my life that doesn't belong there today? God, is there something in my life that I know is supposed to be there, but it's not in there? Would you add that to my life today? Because James says it this way, how could you dare even say you love God if you don't show your brother love? And what Jesus is challenging us today is to say it and to show it. Let your work and your words line up, And that's somebody who really worships me. So here's the challenge that I want to put in front of somebody today. Maybe somebody in this room, or maybe somebody who's tuning in right now is saying, uh-oh, I have been building my life on the shaky foundation, and I need to change the foundation today. Jesus, I need you to do a miracle today. If that's you, in just a second, we're going to pray that the Holy Spirit does something in your life that you couldn't possibly do yourself, that He does this miracle of taking what's dead and making it alive today. Would you bow? Would you let me pray for us today? God our Father, would you take Jesus' words, and would you apply it to our heart? Would you remind us that you want our words and our work, and those two together equal our worship? And maybe somebody came in here because they wanted to be a good girl or a good boy. They know that there's some bad things in their life. And maybe somebody came in here because they were thinking they would earn some points with you. Like at the end of their life, I did more good things than I did bad things, God. And you got to give me credit for the good things. And maybe those good things will outweigh the bad things. And perhaps for the first time in their life, God, they're coming to the realization that if I could do enough good things, if I could earn my way into heaven, then there would be no reason for Jesus to leave heaven and come to earth and die on a cross in the first place. No, the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ is proof that the wages of sin is death. And if I have broken one of the commandments, I deserve to die. But God, I believe you took my punishment and you put it on the shoulders of your Son, Jesus, because you love me and you wanted to make it possible for me to be clean and born again and a child of yours. So, Father, would you cause somebody who's listening to my voice right now to turn from their sin and to radically, totally surrender their life to Jesus by calling him Lord, Lord, which means anything you want, anywhere you want me to go. I'm yours, and I will do it. You call the shots from here on out. I don't. God, would you help your people to go through transformation this week? Not just inspiration. I want that for them. I want that for me. Not just information. Would you help us to go through transformation this week by just simply approaching whatever we do in your name this week with the attitude of, God, would you change my life in whatever way you want it to change this week? And then, God, would you make it so profound that people in our community who are hurting because of the violence and the evil around them look to us for answers because they see something in us that they don't see in themselves. God, be glorified by the way that your people are surrendering to you and turning to Jesus as the foundation rock of their life. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for watching today's broadcast from Jeff Strucker. To learn more about Jeff and his mission to guide men and their families into a real, rugged, and relentless faith in King Jesus, go to jeffstrucker.com.